I am going to, all right, I just hit record. I am now going to call the Citizens Advisory Committee meeting to order. As permitted by the Governor's Disaster Declaration of January 8th, 2021, the determination has been made that an in-person meeting is not practical or prudent for this committee. To ensure that this meeting is as transparent as possible, we will post the meeting materials approximately 1 week in advance, provide a recording of this meeting linked to our website, and we will take all votes by roll call. So for item 2, we will combine the roll call with the approval of the March 9th minutes. Do I have a motion to approve the March 9 meeting? Please state your name and say so moved.
So moved, Lulu Blacksmith.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Second, Daniel Honigman.
Thank you. All right. So we'll now move to the attendance and the approval of the minutes. Please unmute yourself and state yay or nay on the approval of the March 9th minutes. And so now I'm going to do the roll call. Elliot Hartstein.
Aye.
Thank you. Lulu Blacksmith.
Aye.
Thomas Gary. Blake Grisby. Daniel Hageman. Daniel Hageman.
Hi, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes, we can hear you now. No worries. Thank you.
Perfect.
Kevin Ivers. Renee Patton. Stephanie Pressler.
Aye.
Thank you. Ruth Rosas.
Aye.
Thank you. Faye Sinat.
I'm going to say aye because of your excellent communications with me since I missed the last one, but everything seems in order.
Thank you. And Zara Sortwala.
Aye.
All right, thank you. Great. So we do have a quorum. And so for item 3, we do have a few announcements to share with the committee before we move on to today's presentations. I'm now going to invite our Executive Director, Erin Alleman, to share a few updates from the board meeting.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. We actually have our board meeting scheduled to meet tomorrow, and then the MPO Policy Committee is scheduled to meet on Thursday. So you'll get a little bit of preview of what they'll hear and combined with a little bit of stuff that they've heard last month as well. So, but first of all, you know, one of the key deputy positions in our office for focusing on transportation, the TIP, the modeling group, and the research and analysis group has been, we hired a new, a new deputy director over that area. His name is Yusuf Salama. He's not here with us today, unfortunately, but we'll bring him to the group so that y'all can meet him. He has over a decade of experience delivering public infrastructure at a number of public agencies, but he worked for the public-private partnership in Canada, also for the LA County Metropolitan Transportation Authority, and then most recently in the private sector at a consulting firm working on transportation infrastructure as well. So we're excited about the knowledge he brings to the region, and I think that it'll be helpful for us in terms of thinking about how we make sure that we're investing our transportation resources wisely and getting the best return on investment. So I look forward to you all meeting him at a future meeting. Since December, I wanted to touch on a little bit of the conversations we've been having about committees and our committee members. And so, I know it's one of the things that we value so much here at CMAP is all of the people who come to our committees, with your expertise and experience and sharing and contributing to our projects. And it really makes our work that much more meaningful here. We've hired a new director of strategic alignment, innovation, and engagement, and she has been working with us to think through how we can make sure that we're taking best advantage of our committee members' knowledge and expertise, and making sure that our committees are well connected to our board. So I really appreciate this committee's willingness to try new things. We want to make sure that we're making good use of your time as well, so that we are, thinking about how how to leverage these the expertise that you have from your place in the region, from your personal experience and perspectives as well. So you'll see more from Allison as well as we embark on the next few months here and thinking about how we make sure that the committees too have a voice at our board meeting and vice versa. I know that many of us are eager to get back into the office. So I spend a lot of time talking to our board and committee members about this as well. We've started allowing our staff to volunteer to come into the office on Wednesdays and Thursdays. We'll probably add Tuesdays here as an option for staff mid-month. But we have a target date of September 7th, and we're going to stick to that as our planned date for transitioning people back into the office here. Our goal is to do some capacity limitations in the fall. We'll ask staff to work about 10 days per month from the office. And in a perfect world, we'd be able to come up with a regimented structure that would work for everyone, but recognizing that, you know, schools, appointments, all sorts of stuff are going to get in the way. We'll have it as structured as possible, but we are planning on having a more flexible work environment as we head into the fall here. The September board meeting, we do plan to have in person, as well as we'll have an October MPO and board meeting as well, which will both be in person. Over the summer, we will reach out to committee members and committee chairs to talk a little bit about expectations for committees coming back to the office. I know that there is some value in time savings for our committees that represent the entire region, and we want to make sure that we're respectful of your time, but understand where and how the committees would like to convene moving forward. I think one of the complications is that, you know, I think everyone's like, well, can we do a hybrid of an online meeting in an in-person meeting? And I think it really just depends on the agenda and how interactive and engaging and participatory we want those meetings to be. It's hard to design a meeting agenda that works for both people online and people in the room to give people sort of that equal footing and perspective and opportunity to participate. But we may try some new things. We're interested in your ideas as to, you know, what might work for this committee as well. We've heard from some committees, for example, the Freight Committee was like, we like online, we're good with online, we get our business done, and then we get back to work. So again, I imagine that we'll have a couple different solutions and options for committee meetings moving forward, but we'll delve into that a little bit more over the summer here. Well, let me pause and see if there are any questions or thoughts at the moment on the return to in-person meetings here from your committee here, Michelle and Elliot. All right, well, if you have thoughts and you want to share them, please do reach out to Michelle, but we'll plan on reaching out to you as well to get some input and feedback. The last thing I wanted to mention here is that we're also planning a State of the Region Awards and regional State of the Region event and Regional Excellence Awards program for the fall. So please save the date for October 7th. The goal is to have that coincide with the adoption of, or the anniversary of the adoption of the 2050 plan. We really want to share progress with the plan's implementation activities, celebrate some of the successes that a number of our partners have had, and think about how we can continue to move our stakeholders across the region towards this common goal of a more inclusive and thriving region here. So as a way to recognize and celebrate some of the implementation activities that have happened over the past year, as well as to inspire people to take action, we will have our first ever Regional Excellence Awards, and the categories will include an individual visionary from across the region, as well as awards to recognize projects that support the plan's 3 principles of inclusive growth, resiliency, and prioritized investment. And the date will be October 7th. It'll be a breakfast meeting. Well, it'll be during breakfast time. I think too that, again, you know, we've been talking about in-person, virtual combination. So more TBD on that. The award recipients will be recognized at the event, and we also are in the process, the communications team is in the process of developing our first ever public opinion poll. So one of the things that we think would be valuable to us advancing the principles of the plan is to really understand where the public sits on a number of these issues that we care about, so that we can develop plans, programs, educational opportunities to talk about some of these issues and why they matter, whether it's related to climate or motor fuel taxes and electrification of vehicle fleets. You know, there are a whole bunch of areas I think that are worthy of us pursuing some opportunities to talk to the public about why it is these are good policies for the future of our region and the people of our region. So Mark your calendars, October 7th. And I think that is it for me in terms of updates. I'm happy to answer any questions about anything else that's going on or at the agency or anything else that you're interested in terms of CMAP.
Before you go on, I just was curious to what extent, if at all, CMAP has looked at or shared input or had discussions about the various iterations of infrastructure that's been talked about by the president and as part of the move toward an attempted bipartisan approach and versus the president's different ideas. Obviously, I know that our plans are rather all encompassing and touch a lot of different areas. So I would think that I'm just like, just looking at it, there are a lot of good things in the president's proposal, but I don't think we're going to see all those things happen, at least in the short term. And we don't know what's going to happen. But I'm just wondering what CMAT has done, if at all, in terms of looking at that stuff, and any feedback has been given, or committees working on it, or anything like that.
Yeah, so we'll be giving an update on the federal infrastructure bill that's being discussed right now. I think we have weighed in a couple of times, both individually as a regional agency, but also jointly with MPOs from across the country to put forth a couple things that we think are important, not only for the president's infrastructure bill, but also the transportation bill that's expiring this September. And there are opportunities, I think, for us to really help drive home the point that transportation is the means and not the ends, right? It connects us to housing, to jobs, it connects our economy and helps move our goods. But, that's the reason why transportation infrastructure exists. And so, the opportunity to think more holistically about bringing together sort of the economic needs, housing, water, the environment together under that umbrella of transportation is one of the things we've been talking with our delegation about. I think one of the other notes that I'll share too is I've had meetings with everyone, all of our congressional delegates, and they are excited, I think, about a broad-based infrastructure bill that includes things that are good for families, includes broadband initiatives as well. I think one of the concerns is that if this infrastructure bill comes out now soonish, I know that they were targeting sort of the end of today to have some sort of deal, but I'm not sure that that's going to happen, is that this comes through a reconciliation process, whereas the transportation bill that expires in September is sort of the regulatory process. And so, to the extent that the public thinks that then there are two infrastructure bills, it just becomes a little bit confusing. So I would hate for the excitement around this broad-based bill to sort of get in the way of making good progress on the transportation bill, the transportation title, and thinking about how climate could be addressed through that, performance measures for safety and freight programs too. So they're a little bit competing in terms of their interests, but I think both are vitally important.
Yeah, I was just thinking, you all have done such a terrific job of outreach for the 2040. I was just thinking, as people have gotten more comfortable with computer access, and with the hope for investment for more broadband availability to more communities, just thinking in terms of what might be some really interesting anchor points through which to advertise and distribute your surveys. Of course, libraries being the first, churches being another, PTOs, PTAs kind of thing, as well as your usual municipality connections. And even through institutions like, what used to be the Donors Forum. The new name is escaping me at this point, where they could relay it through the nonprofit community. Just trying to think of nodes that could amplify your message and get more people involved in the surveys to enhance the quality of the data. And recognizing that we're still short in terms of underdeveloped communities, perhaps CHA itself could set up opportunities for residents to participate. Just trying to think of all of those nodes that could help amplify and improve the quality of the information that you gather.
Yeah, thanks for all those ideas, Faye. And I should have gone into a little bit more detail on the public opinion survey. We actually have hired a firm that does statistically significant surveys for across the region. So our hope is that we get a, I don't know how to describe it except for statistically significant, but that they're looking at the demographics of the region and the demographics of the people who are taking the survey and are able to sort of get us that geographic representation that we want in terms of age, gender, race across the region, household income as well. So we're hopeful to get some interesting feedback, but I do think, you're right, Faye, that there are lots of other organizations that we can and should be working with as we think about, again, what comes out, what the results of that public opinion survey, and then how do we sort of delve into the details about who we need to reach about different issue areas so that we can make sure that our work is being heard in the right forums.
Yeah, I'd like to second what Faye said, and thank you, and hi, everyone. Don't forget, if you're going to do public forums, you've got a couple of community colleges sitting in here, so we've worked with you in the past, so hopefully that can help.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stephanie.
Any other comments or questions for Erin? All right. Well, thank you, Erin. We always appreciate the updates at the top of our call. We do have a packed agenda today, so we're going to move right along to our first presentation. And so just to provide you with some background, today's presentations are all focused on climate. As we talked about at our meeting last year, we wanted to spend more time catering each meeting to a particular theme. So we have our first presentation for today from Nora Beck, who will present on CMAP's water demand forecast.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Hi, everybody, I'm Nora Beck. I'm a senior planner with CMAP, and I want to provide you with an overview of the regional water demand forecast for Northeastern Illinois. I'll also review the status of our current water sources and how that relates to upcoming demands, and then step through how demand and supply information could help us make more informed planning decisions. So Michelle, are you advancing the slide, or Dustin?
Dustin.
Okay, Dustin, next slide, yeah. So really quickly, why do we forecast? Communities across the globe are facing an array of water resource challenges. We've got growing population, habitat degradation, climate change. These all continue to impact the provision of clean, reliable water to residents and businesses. And the Chicago region is not immune. Despite our regional access to Lake Michigan, significant portions of the region depend on groundwater and are encountering water supply and quality issues. As the regional planning agency, CMAP is concerned about these challenges, and our latest comprehensive plan until 2050 anticipates that these issues will grow unless steps are taken to coordinate and conserve the region's shared water supply. Next slide. So having an up-to-date long-range forecast helps us do that in a number of ways. First, water scientists at the Illinois State Water Survey use our information to run analyses on the condition of our water supply. And through their incorporation of the demands into their models, they can give us a better picture of our larger water supply context and generally bring greater awareness to water supply issues in our region. And finally, by understanding what drives water use and the demand for water, we can then start to identify key practices and policies that will help us conserve water and maintain a safe supply into the future. So the next slide, we've got our current forecast. So support from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources allowed CMAP to partner with Margaret Schneemann, who is a water resource economist with the Illinois Indiana Sea Grant, to develop a regional water demand forecast and include those results in our last comprehensive plan. So I'm going to get into those details now. In the next slide, you can see that by 2050, the region is projected to add more than 2.3 million residents and 900,000 new jobs. And this chart shows those values in gray and dark gray respectively. Despite the demands of a growing population and economy, our total water demand is projected to stay relatively stable, as shown in the blue on this chart. By 2050, our total water withdrawals in the 7-county region will be about 1,100 million gallons of water per day. And that's an increase of less than 1% from withdrawals that we saw in 2013. But in the next slide, we can see that that's largely because we are assuming our existing conservation and efficiency practices, which have led to a steady decline in water use per person and per employee, will continue. So water use per person and per employee is estimated to decrease by approximately 20% by the year 2050 to 65 gallons per capita per day for the residential sector, and then 84 gallons per employee per day for the non-residential sector. However, in this next slide, we know that the real story about the long-term sustainability of our region's water supply depends on the location of that demand and the source of water that's supplying it. So as you know, CMAP regularly updates the socioeconomic forecast that estimates the location of future population and employment based on existing conditions, market trends, and policy recommendations. And by 2050, CMAP anticipates an additional 1.5 million residents and 500,000 new jobs in communities that are currently depending on groundwater. And those are highlighted in this map in shades of orange and brown. This map is showing all the different sources by municipality. So consequently, water demand is projected to substantially increase in areas relying on groundwater. Next slide. And generally that forecasted demand is anticipated to exceed groundwater supplies in some locations. This chart is showing that projected change in water demand by source from 2011 to 2050. Demand in the shallow groundwater dependent communities is anticipated to increase 33%, while demand in the sandstone aquifer dependent communities is projected to increase by 35%. And you can see in this chart that we are projecting a 9% decline in Lake Michigan withdrawals by the year 2050. So next slide, why does it matter that demand is growing in groundwater areas? I want to step through the conditions and the status of our different water sources. So let's start with groundwater. It's a bit more mysterious given that we can't see it. We've got groundwater dependent communities that rely on several different types of aquifers as shown in the blue layers of this diagram. The top portion are the shallow aquifers, and these get fairly quickly replenished by rainwater, and they help provide flow to our lakes and streams. Below them are what we call the deep aquifers, or in this region often referred to as the sandstone aquifers. These aquifers are not as connected to what's happening on the land surface, and the water that's in there has taken centuries or millennia to get into the location. So we're going to step through these different layers. The next slide highlights an issue that's happening with the shallow aquifers. So because shallow aquifers are closer to the land surface, they are more susceptible to contamination. So chemical spills, brownfields, all have the potential to contaminate our shallow aquifers. In this region, road salts applied to the streets and parking lots during the winter have begun to contaminate the shallow aquifers. This diagram shows a snapshot of road salt or chloride contamination in Kane County over time. And it basically follows the development pattern of the county. As more roads and housing and businesses were built, more salt is applied and levels have begun to reach the EPA standard for secondary treatment. Salt is generally very difficult to remove and can impact the taste. In the next slide, we know that because the shallow aquifers are generally replenished by recent rainfall, they are also more susceptible to periods of drought. And right now we're in one. This is the map from the U.S. Drought Monitor. We have a severe drought happening in Lake County, McHenry County, parts of Kane, DuPage, and Cook. And so this generally can mean that there's less water supply for those areas. And some of our utility partners are already sharing information that indicates that there's been a drop in water levels in shallow aquifers. So let's go even deeper down underground, and we reach the sandstone aquifers. So this is where the water has taken centuries or millennia to accumulate. These aquifers are slower to recharge, and our rate of pumping water out is generally faster than it can be replenished. So that means in the over 100 years that we've been using these sandstone aquifers, we've been using a lot of that stored water. And as a result, we are starting to see some areas where there is no water left, and that's referred to as desaturation. This diagram is a cross section of northeastern Illinois, and you can see the lake in the back, and then the area in the foreground represents Kendall County and western Will County. And you can see that that area at risk of desaturation is highlighted in red in the St. Peter and then parts of the Ironton Galesville, which is even further down underground. In the next slide, you can see recent work by the Illinois State Water Survey, and they've shed light on this mismatch between what a sustainable withdrawal would be from the aquifer, as shown in red, and then the amount that we are currently withdrawing, which is about 30 million gallons of water per day just in the Will County area. In the next slide, you can see what the impacts are. We are anticipating further desaturation of this aquifer in the coming decades. The city of Joliet has committed to moving off of the aquifer in the year 2030. And you can see the condition of that aquifer that's projected just before that year in 2029 in the middle here. Once they move off, as indicated by this model, it definitely helps the issue, but you can see that that desaturation continues in this area by 2050 unless additional conservation or alternative water sources are procured. So next slide, that leads us to recognize Lake Michigan, right? Lake Michigan is, of course, a tremendous asset for the region. It is largely not impacted by climate change. However, our use of it is regulated. The reversal of the Chicago River and the subsequent stormwater and wastewater infrastructure changed how the water flows, redirects it from the lake and sending it down the Illinois River and eventually the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico. Next slide. Oh yeah, animation. Thank you. So this massive withdrawal from the lake has been grandfathered in, but we have to stay within a water budget. And we've committed to water conservation and efficiency goals to be a good partner to our neighboring Great Lakes states. So that's a real quick and dirty summary of the status of our water sources. Understanding both the available supply of water and then our current and future demand is really critical to making informed land use, transportation, and infrastructure investment decisions. So next slide. With some communities anticipating significant increases in water demand by the year 2050, ensuring that there is an adequate and sustainable water supply will be increasingly important. During a comprehensive planning process, future land use plans could consider how proposed growth patterns could impact available supplies, as well as the infrastructure capacity, and adjust policies accordingly. As new development is proposed, communities could review the potential demand generated from that development to help implement water resource goals. And then to make these assessments, land use planners and water utility managers will need to work together and align local planning efforts with current and future water supply constraints. Addressing drinking water issues has historically been left to water utilities, yet we know that planning and development decisions influence the amount of water used, the supply and the quality of our water sources, and then the cost of maintaining water service. So understanding how these different decisions impact drinking water provision is essential for maintaining a long-term supply and a well-functioning utility. So I'm going to just step through some key concepts here. In the next slide, we know that development typically includes impervious surfaces that reduce the infiltration capacity of the ground below, and it generates runoff. And that runoff can carry pollutants like road salts and fertilizers and pollute nearby streams, as well as shallow groundwater aquifers. So planning practices that avoid sensitive lands, protecting natural areas, and using infill and redevelopment to accommodate growth are really important on the development side of things. And then once a development happens, implementing stormwater best management practices and other pollution prevention strategies, such as sensible salting, can help us protect the quality of our drinking water. In the next slide, we can see that certain land uses, certain building types, different development patterns consume more water than others. And we also know that those development patterns can play a role in the design of the water system itself and the needed maintenance it requires to maintain a good system. So compact development, as well as water efficient plumbing, building, and landscaping standards can make it easier for residents to simply use less water to begin with. They don't have to actively do anything in response. In the next slide, I just talk more about landscaping. We know that approximately 30% of residential water use in the region is dedicated to outdoor watering, and as much as 50% of that water is wasted due to watering inefficiencies. So drought aside, summer use can strain resources and infrastructure, cause peak usage to rise, and increase the need for costly infrastructure upgrades. And as a condition of their Lake Michigan permit, many communities are required to have lawn watering restrictions. And so you can see all of those communities in blue. For those that are not part of the Lake Michigan area, the Northwest Water Planning Alliance, which is a group that Faye is involved with, they are self-organizing to maintain reliable water supply in the northwest portion of our region. They developed a model ordinance for improving lawn watering practices. Adopting this ordinance is a good step in reducing inefficient use of water that is often associated with outdoor lawn watering. And this next slide, I want to talk about how all of this together, water efficient land use decisions and other conservation practices have an additional benefit of helping utilities reduce the cost of expensive capacity expansion. And so this diagram, Dustin, if you could hit play, that would be great. Oh, I think you might have to actually, yeah, I don't know how that quite works. Thank you. This diagram illustrates how an effective water conservation program can affect the timing of capital facility construction and thus save money. So as a growing community reaches the capacity of their water treatment plants, they design expanded capacity to meet that future demand. But through water demand, by reducing water demand through conservation, they can potentially achieve two cost savings. They can get delay that needed expansion, and then they can downsize the size of that needed infrastructure when it becomes necessary. So I wanted to close by giving you an update on our future work. You can see that having an up-to-date water demand forecast is critical for our water supply planning efforts. The next slide, CMAP will be partnering again with Margaret Schneemann with the Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant Program and working closely with the Illinois State Water Survey to make sure that the region has a demand forecast that reflects our latest understanding of population and employment projections, as well as development and transportation patterns. We're going to try to use CMAP's new land use model to do this work, which I'm really excited about. We're also going to try to enhance our ability to forecast industrial and commercial use, which is sort of tricky just given the diversity of different types of uses within that category. So these will be coming, this will be something that we are working on in the next year and a half. And I'm excited to show those results to you. And in the meantime, I encourage you to check out our current water demand forecast. In the next slide, I think I've got the link here. You can find our demand data by region, county, and municipality. And you can see how the different factors of demand influence current and future water use. So I'm happy to answer any questions if there's time. And if you check out the data, please let me know and let me know what you think of it as well. Thank you.
Just briefly, what communication has there been, or what work has been done on the state level on this issue? And similarly, with the various water commissions or entities that sort of coordinate the dissemination of Lake Michigan water in different parts of the metropolitan area.
So on the first one, Elliot, the state has actually funded us to help to do a lot of water supply planning. One of the key things that they do is fund us to do the demand forecast, as well as the Illinois State Water Survey to do the science and make sure that all of the utility operators are operating with more information about each of our water sources. The state is about to launch a full demand and supply forecast for each county within the state. So we look forward to seeing that larger picture. The state is also engaged in a state water plan that is in the works right now. It will have a section about water sustainability and water use and regulations, in addition to covering a number of other items like flooding and climate change and those types of things. And as far as the commissions, I know that they're very, the Lake Michigan service area commissions are very involved in in making sure that they're providing water, and there's been a lot of action within the Joliet area exploring different commission formats or different ways of structuring a shared regional supply. I'm not entirely remembering your question, Elliot, on that last point.
That's all, that's what it's talking, the various commission. That was pretty much it.
Okay.
Thank you.
If I might build on the point that you had started to make about the utility companies, one thing we've seen more from power utilities are peak savings time alerts, where if you don't, either run your air from, 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock, you can save money and you get credits. Is this something that water utilities are doing as well that could encourage people to not use as much water during key times? Or is this, a potential gap, or is this not really an opportunity on your radar at this point?
So limiting outdoor lawn watering is sort of a comparable a strategy to what you were describing with energy, right? The peak time of water use is often on the hottest day. And we know that as people water their lawns or their gardens and plants, that really causes a lot of strain on not only the supply, but as well as the infrastructure. So that's one key strategy that utilities use. The level of deployment of that strategy in the region is probably not comparable to what we see with energy companies. We know that the Northwest Water Planning Alliance, through their work in promoting an outdoor lawn watering ordinance, has gone a long way. But there are definitely areas that don't have any of these strategies in place at the moment.
I have a
Thank you.
related question about strategies. So my community organization, we try to do a lot of facilitation, education, and native plantings in parkways, in the yards, and public areas. Do you know if, I know that it's supposed to help with water. Is there actual research locally that it does?
Yes, that there is. My colleague Margaret Schneemann at the Illinois Indiana Sea Grant has compiled a lot of research on how native plantings can help us reduce water consumption. I'm happy to share that with you, Renee.
Yeah, I'm curious. I wrote down your email to follow up. I had another question too, if that's okay, Michelle, if we have enough time. So does CMAP have an official stand on the Water for All ordinance in Chicago, or do you have any personal opinions on it? My nonprofit, we're having somebody present on it tomorrow to our group, actually.
That's a really good question, Renee. I have to admit, I don't know it as well as I should. And to date, we have not yet made a statement about that, but it's something that we'll look into.
Yeah, I imagine our organization's probably going to sign on in support of it. So good stuff there.
Mm-hmm.
And hi, Nora. This is Faye. I have two questions in the chat, but I was going to piggyback on Renee's and say that I would also love a copy of some of the more effective research that's out there in terms of native plantings. I got to thinking about fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides all have a salt component. And I assume that that's some kind of, chloride. And I just wondered if there are any studies as to how much those sources are contaminating waters by a runoff, because we know that's happening as people over fertilize their lawns.
Mm-hmm.
They over pesticide and herbicide them too. But
yeah, I believe that detailed sampling efforts in McHenry County, and then some work that's going on right now in Will County, will really shed light on all the different contaminants that are impacting our shallow groundwater sources. I don't have specific numbers on pesticides, but if road salt is going through, I think we can imagine that a bunch of other contaminants are coming into our water supplies as well.
I assume that, but just wondered what percentage of chloride they're impacting it again.
Yeah.
Then, and I wondered, this is kind of an old question because I can remember asking it before in another CMAP meeting, and I don't think you were there. But I just wondered if CMAP is coordinating with the various municipalities and forest preserve districts to identify parcels that should be protected because they recharge aquifers, or that should not have been developed and should be acquired if they, come on the market so they can be restored. Mm-hmm. If there's any effort along those lines to kind of refurbish our capacity to recharge our water supply.
Yes, we've primarily done that through the Green Infrastructure Vision and our partnership with the Chicago Wilderness. In Onto 2050, we did develop a conservation areas layer that was paying attention to the ability of natural lands, different types of natural lands within the region to help us recharge our aquifer. It's something that we recommend in different comprehensive plans as we look at what are the natural resources in an area and how can we ensure that we're not developing over these critical areas that are providing services and cleaning our water. So that's primarily how I work through that issue at our agency.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Nora, we have one other question in the chat
Oh, sure.
from Thomas Gary. His question was, how receptive has MWRD and other water management agencies been in creating and enforcing water discipline?
Yeah, so it's interesting. MWRD is really focused on the other end of the water cycle, right? They're really focused on wastewater. And so they are, my understanding is that they're involved in trying to reduce road salt contamination and chlorides because they know that that stuff gets treated through their, or not treated through their system, and it can impact water bodies. So I'm not sure if I'm totally answering that question, but they are a partner as we look forward to pollution prevention strategies.
Yeah, and the other evil reality is that most water utilities get paid on water use, and there's no base charge in terms of providing a basic clean water. We're terribly underinvested in water. And of course, the EPA hasn't updated what water utilities should take out of the water in decades.
Yeah, the EPA is launching a study to sample all community water suppliers in the state for PFAS right now. That's a hot topic where they're looking into the distribution of this contaminant. And it could lead, probably in several years, lead to a standard for eliminating this in the treatment process.
Well, thank you, Nora, for your time and for answering all of our questions. Nora has also provided her email address here on this final slide. So if any questions come up in the next couple of weeks, feel free to reach out. So we're just going to move along to our next presentation for today. So Jason Novota will be giving a brief presentation on CMAT's fiscal year 2022 climate work plan.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Jason Novota, I am a director in our Plan Implementation and Legislative Affairs group. And just take a few minutes today to summarize for you the work that we are doing around the climate topic. Next slide, please. As many of you may know or recall, Onto 2050 has an environment chapter. And within that environment chapter, we have a goal for climate, and that is a region prepared for climate change. If you could click once, please. And that climate goal really consists of two primary strategies, let's say. One is focused on mitigation, that is reducing the volume of greenhouse gas emissions of carbon that are released into the atmosphere, and as a result, minimizing the effects of climate change. Whereas the second broad strategy is to plan for climate resilience, and that is, we know that the climate is changing currently. We know that it is going to continue to change until we can sort of get it under control as a globe. And so we need to be prepared for the changes that we are already experiencing, and be prepared for more extreme changes in our communities, for our populations, our infrastructure, and really everything. And so next slide, please. And so within Onto 2050, of course, there are many strategies and there are many actions that the plan recommends for the region. Some of those are directed towards ourselves, CMAP. Others are directed towards ourselves in partnership with others. And the rest are directed towards other partners that we would not be involved in. However, despite there being many, many things that we could be doing, we do have to focus our limited resources on a few priorities. And so in this current fiscal year, which is going to come to a close for us at the end of June, we've been working on a number of projects, and for the fiscal year that starts on July 1, we are adding a few projects to that list. But as a whole, these are the 8 discrete projects that we are working on currently. And I would like to just briefly describe each of these for you to give you an idea of the kinds of work that is underway. So the first project, Regional Climate Planning and Coordination, it's a bit of a general project where we are working with partners, communicating with partners, convening, having conversations, the general sort of facilitation and coordination that CMAP does for the region. But also the other part of this is to be looking out a number of years ahead in order to put more of our work plan elements in place. So we'll be identifying where we want to be in 3 to 5 years and then putting in place a number of projects in addition to those that you see here that will help us achieve those goals. And then finally, if there are new elements or new projects that we want to take on, they will sort of have their genesis within this project. So an example might be, we might spin off a specific project around climate equity or climate justice. And if we were to do that, this is the project wherein that conversation would happen and where we would spin that climate equity project out of. The second project listed here, Transportation Mitigation Strategies, is one you're going to hear about in more detail when I'm finished from Martin. And so he will give you some of the results of the work that we've done thus far. But basically, this project is about exploring the different strategies that the region can take in the transportation sector to reduce emissions, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So these strategies, well, Martin will go into those, so I won't steal his thunder. So currently we're just exploring what strategies, what effect strategies may have. And this project, looking out into the future, will start looking at different policies that we might start to explore and research and potentially to advance. The third project here is the electric vehicle infrastructure strategy. So if you're watching the news, you see a lot of news and talk about electric vehicles and charging infrastructure and so on. And we understand that there really is no regional strategy for building out the charging infrastructure. There really is no strategy to speak of at all for building out that infrastructure. There are private companies that install chargers where they find it to be most convenient or the permitting to be the easiest and things like that. But there's really no strategic approach to doing so. And knowing that the state has some funds through the Volkswagen settlement to install charging infrastructure and has identified some other funds to do so, we think that it may make sense to start thinking about whether a regional strategy for installing that charging infrastructure makes sense. The fourth project here is sort of aligned with another program that CMAP has, where we provide technical planning assistance to our 283 communities. We do a variety of things through that program. We do comprehensive plans, transportation plans, a whole variety of types of plans and other kinds of assistance and support. And so we want to add to our portfolio of things that we are supporting these communities with, we want to add climate mitigation and adaptation strategies to that to help our communities prepare and to help them take action. The fifth project is really intended to catalog and summarize the data that CMAP has that might be useful in doing climate planning, either for regional partners or for some of our local partners. So whether that's heat or flooding data or emissions data, greenhouse gas emissions data, or what have you, we're compiling that information, and at some point we will figure out a way to either serve it up on a web page or some other format or vehicle for getting this information out to our partners. There's another project that will be part of this, and that is to look at heat stress in the region, climate-induced heat stress, and where our most vulnerable areas may be as it relates to heat. We've done this sort of analysis for flooding, for urban flooding. It's called our Flood Susceptibility Index. It's available on our website. And we want to prepare a companion piece that's focused on heat. The sixth project, which you will also hear about today, and that's why these two and 6 are highlighted in orange, is a project whereby we are exploring how we should be reporting out on greenhouse gas emissions and how we should be monitoring greenhouse gas emissions. We don't currently do that as a matter of course. We do some emissions reporting and monitoring and modeling for air quality, because our region is out of conformity with air quality standards. And so this is something we have to do to meet the requirements of federal law around air quality. But we haven't done that around greenhouse gas emissions. So we're exploring ways that we should be doing that and a way that we will be doing that going forward. The 7th project, Regional Greenhouse Gas Inventory, is, as some of you I think know, we've done greenhouse gas inventories for the region for the years 2010 and 2015, and we backcasted an inventory to the year 2005. And so we're going to update that regional greenhouse gas inventory for the year 2019. And we should be doing it for the year 2020, but 2020 was such an off year that we think 2019 is a more representative year to do the regional inventory. So we'll be doing that this year, and that work should be complete by July of next year of 2022. And then finally, later in the fiscal year, we're going to be taking on a regional transportation vulnerability assessment. That is, explore our transportation system, all of its assets, and try to identify which of those assets are the most vulnerable to the impacts of a changing climate. So specifically looking at flooding and heat impacts, but we want to understand our region and where our greatest vulnerabilities are, where we might want to focus additional capital investments or additional attention in some other way. So that's the slate of projects that we have going both the current year and the coming year. It's keeping us busy, of course, and as I mentioned, Martin is going to follow me to talk a little bit about this project number 2, and then I believe Russell's going to talk about project number 6, or actually I think Russell's talking about air quality, and Martin's going to talk a little bit about this reporting project. So Michelle, Dustin, should I take some questions, or do we want to wait until Martin's done his piece?
Sure. Actually, Jason, we have one question in the chat for you,
Okay.
and then we can move along to Martin's presentation, if that's all right.
Sure.
So our question is from Faye. Question is, are there any plans for helping to train municipalities and other government or even private industries in assessing GHG emissions inventory with CMAP best practices? This might help create some common protocols which would enhance the reliability of the data and provide a stronger basis for the future.
Right. So we don't have plans right now to train them to do that. However, in the inventory that we're about to undertake, we're going to be preparing inventories for each individual municipality. And to the extent that the data is available, we're going to also be doing that for each of the Chicago community areas, or it might be by ward, or it might be by zip code. It kind of depends on the availability of the data. So rather than having each of them do their own, we decided it's better if we prepare those for them, give them that baseline, and then as we continue to do this going forward, we can provide a sort of a monitoring service to the region's municipalities. So that's our plan right now.
Thank you, Jason. Elliot, was that a comment or question?
Question. I had a question on the particular interest in the electric infrastructure strategies. And I just was wondering if there are any specific ideas that are being promoted to facilitate that, or is there brainstorming going on as to what those ideas could be or should be, and how might they be promoted?
Well, the brainstorming is just getting underway for us. And although there are a lot of partners in the region who are in various ways working on the transportation system, either through electrification or other strategies, to our knowledge, and we did a number of interviews about a year ago with various partners who are working in the climate space in the region, and no one knows about any sort of any coordinated effort that's happening. So I think it's happening in pockets, but nothing coordinated, and our own brainstorming is just getting underway. I think one of our first activities under that project is going to be to host a forum of some sort, a conversation with all the partners who might be involved, and try to start generating those strategies that you are asking about. The final thing I'll say about that is that the legislation at the state level does have some information about electrification. The energy bill, CEJA, it goes by various names. It didn't pass yet, but I have a lot of hope for it. But there are some electrification elements in that bill.
Thanks. I think it's a key key thing for the future, and I'm hoping that at this the concept of a meeting I think is great, and that to the extent that some good ideas come out of such a meeting, possibly CMAP could help facilitate directing these things to the appropriate components and partners for implementation. So I think that's a good first start, though. That's great.
Thanks, Elliot. Yeah, we'd be happy to do whatever we can.
All right, I think we can move along to Martin. So our next presentation will be from Martin Menninger on transportation reduction strategies.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to talk about one specific project and sort of allude to or touch on some of the other strategies that Jason just shared with you. I'll start off by talking about some of our greenhouse gas inventory work we've done. This slide, yep, go ahead. This slide is from our 2015 inventory that Jason mentioned and that we're updating for 2019. So just to sort of lay the groundwork for where our greenhouse gas emissions are in the region, about 29% of them are in the transportation area. Some of them are off-road. A lot of those are sort of your trains and your boats and your airplanes, construction equipment and things like that. For this project, we're really focused on the on-road emissions. Those are 24% of all emissions in the region in 2015. So want to move those down. If you want to go to the next slide. How do those on-road emissions sort of break out? The first two categories here, sort of the blue and the red, are your passenger vehicles, your sedans and your SUVs. The orange and the green are your freight vehicles for the most part and commercial vehicles. And then the blue is like your motorcycles and all those other things that don't fit cleanly in. What we see when we look at some of the data is that the VMT or vehicle miles traveled for these different vehicle types are fairly consistent over time when we look in the future. 85–90% of VMT is those passenger vehicles, cars and SUVs. And they are about 60% of emissions. One thing that's interesting when we looked at this data is that, and I give credit to Russell, who's following up, he'll correct me when what I told you wrong. He put this slide together with the help of Sarah on our team. One thing that's interesting, the passenger emissions decline in our modeling, while the freight emissions decline much less. One of the reasons for that is that our model reflects legislation, and legislation mandates that passenger vehicles become clean much faster than freight vehicles. So that's sort of a artifact of how legislation was passed. But one thing that's clear is that even though trucks are a small percent of total miles traveled, because of their size and just the physics of them, they produce a much larger share of emissions than passenger vehicles, which is something that sort of kept coming up throughout our modeling. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our scenarios. The way we approach this is we looked at different ways that we could reduce emissions in the transportation sector. If you want to jump to the next slide, and we run those through our travel behavior model. So this is the model that we use for conformity, and we use for a lot of our different transportation modeling. And in that model, we can really only look at policies that impact either the infrastructure, the roadway network, or how people use that network. For our travel behavior model, we can't really, it doesn't mean anything to the model if we change a vehicle from a gas vehicle to an electric vehicle. That doesn't change how people behave. It really focuses on behavior. So we do care about technology. First, I'll talk about our travel behavior scenarios. 3 big ways to reduce emissions in the travel behavior world are to make the roadways more efficient. You can build what we call regionally significant projects, which looks at expanding the highways and things like that, making traffic signals and things more efficient, and a variety of different ways we've studied to reduce congestion. We can reduce demand for roads, having people work from home, increasing the price of driving or just the price of traveling tends to reduce demand for traveling. And then finally, we can shift people to cleaner modes. So transit is typically talked about, but also biking and walking are major ways to reduce emissions using travel behavior. Sort of the other side of that is the vehicles and technology. These are things that CMAP has slightly less impact on, typically legislated at the national level or state level, and often dependent on innovation and things that are a little bit outside of our world. But as Jason mentioned, we're looking at strategies to build a charging network. So something that still CMAP has a role in. What's interesting about these is, as I said, they're less sort of policy driven, but they do have a major impact on emissions. When you make 30% of the fleet electric, you do get a significant emissions reductions, depending on where your power supply comes from and things like that. The other sort of interesting thing in the vehicle electrification area is it might be a slightly different strategy for different types of vehicles. Transit vehicles that run on a regular route and return to the same place every night might have one strategy, where a freight vehicle that's crossing the country, crossing many states, might have a much different strategy and much different alternative fuel and technology needs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And it's not just about electrification. So we've seen dramatic improvements in gas vehicles. They're much more, they use fewer gallons per mile to travel. We've gotten larger cars as a response to that. If we went back to smaller cars, 30% smaller car has a much lower fuel consumption and greenhouse gas impact. And then finally, there's alternate fuels. So people talk about hydrogen can be made clean. And there's a couple other that are out there that have some potential. So we're keeping an eye on those. And this, I have this out of scope area. So there are a lot of things that have a big impact that we weren't necessarily looking in this study, such as how the vehicles are made and the electric source for things. Those are really important. Air is a major area that's going to be interesting to see how they solve carbon emissions for air and marine transportation. Sort of a future analysis for us. So let's go to the next slide. These are our modeling results. And when I first started sharing this slide, it was a much shorter list and easier to get through. So I won't go through all of this with you. Sort of, in my mind, the key column, I should have made it the first, but it is the GHG, the second number there is the greenhouse gas reductions. You'll notice that it is not perfectly in sync with the vehicles miles traveled, the first column. So when we reduce passenger vehicle trips by 15%, we only get a 10% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions because freight emissions are staying about the same. So we're reducing emissions in one area, but a relatively small piece of the pie is shrinking. Let me just highlight a few things for you here. When we have a few strategies. You see pricing parking has a 15% increase in transit ridership, or doubling bus service has a 12% increase in in transit ridership. Those have somewhat impacts impacts on greenhouse gases and VMT. One, transit ridership is a relatively small share of total travel in this region. And the second thing is, when we take a lot of trips off the road, our model accounts for induced demand. And so taking trips off of the road makes space for other people to drive or take longer trips. And so we don't see the reductions in greenhouse gases that you might expect from taking that many people off the road. The other thing I want to highlight is that in the greenhouse gas column, most of these numbers are single digit. The only double digit one we have is sort of our pandemic extreme work from home scenario that probably isn't the world most people want to live in. But all these other strategies are having single digit changes in greenhouse gases. So one way we're thinking about it is travel behavior is definitely an important part of reducing emissions. And it's going to be important for equity reasons, and it makes things safer and makes our neighborhoods more livable. But it's just one part of the strategy. We really need an all of the above, do all of these and more kind of thing. And not on this list is things like alternate fuels and electrification. So those are going to be a big piece. If you go to the next slide here, this red line indicates what our current projection for greenhouse gases in the region. And we know that that's got to change. We've got to bend that curve downward towards 2050. And all of this data is sort of setting us up to have that conversation. How quickly can we change things? What are the levers that actually make a difference? How quickly can we change, and who needs to be involved, and things like that. So we know that one of these blue lines is going to need to be our new path to reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the region. And in the next year, we'll be working on that. So if you go to the next slide, we've really just begun to look at sort of the impact of alternative fuels and hydrogen, thinking about that technology path to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In the next year, we're going to be setting targets for the transportation share of greenhouse gases and working with our partners to develop a plan for achieving that and having a rational path there. And along with that will be the policy recommendations that we think make sense to achieve those targets. So I think that's my last slide. Does anybody have any questions?
Hey, Martin. Yes, there are a couple questions in the chat, but in the interest of time, would you mind if we move to Russell and then we can circle back to these questions after his presentation?
That's fine with me.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
So we're now going to hand it over to Russell to provide us with the presentation on air quality conformity updates.
All right, and I noticed that she avoided my last name. That was good.
Did you catch that?
So my name is Russell Petroviak. I'm going to be giving an air quality presentation here. So we can go to the next slide. There are three main things related to air quality that are germane to the region. This presentation will mainly focus on the first one, which is ozone. I'll briefly talk about particulate matter, and you've already heard a lot about greenhouse gases, so I'm not going to try to rehash that very much. Next slide. Okay, next slide. So I don't know everybody's background, so because of that, there's going to be a few basics that I go over before we get into some of the more details. What is ozone? This slide kind of really is a good way to encapsulate that. It's stuff that comes out of your tailpipes from your cars. It's generated by factories. It's generated by power plants, all kinds of stuff. But it's basically NOx and VOCs, volatile organic compounds. And you combine that with sunlight, and that's how ozone is produced. Now, the weather has a very large impact on this. So it's not just people driving around and in power plants and all that kind of stuff, producing VOCs and NOx. As you know, we don't really have much ozone in the winter. So it is sunlight, it's the angle of the sun, it's the temperature. We tend to have in our region, a sweet spot where the temperatures are in the very high 80s, low 90s, and we have sunlight and not a lot of wind. That tends to be our sweet spot for when we have really high ozone readings. So next slide. All right, so we are in a non-attainment area for ozone. We've never attained any of the standards per se, other than the very beginning standards in 1997. So our region is all of this, it's the same region primarily that you see for CMAP. The only difference is that we have in the non-attainment area one township, Oswego Township in Kendall County, whereas our planning area has all of Kendall County. Ozone standards, it's a little complicated here. I'll try to walk us through this. There actually are, because of a variety of lawsuits, two standards that we have to adhere to for ozone. Typically what happens is there is a standard for ozone. Then they come up with a new standard and they repeal the old standard, and you only have to adhere to the most current standard. Because of some lawsuits and the way that the previous standard was attempted to be repealed and rejected by the courts, we actually have the old standard from 2008 and the most current standard, which actually looks like I have a typo on this slide. It should have said 2015. So there's the 2008 standard and the 2015 standard. And those standards are set by the US EPA. And all of this stuff is covered under the Clean Air Act. What's also important is that in addition to the standards, the non-attainment area is submitted by Illinois EPA and approved by US EPA. So CMAP, we just respond to these things, but we don't have any say in either the non-attainment area classification or the geography or the standards. And then finally on the classification. So the longer you go without attaining, the more you keep getting bumped up into more and more severe classifications of ozone. So because the 2008 standard hasn't been repealed, we are now in serious non-attainment for that standard. When they come up with a new standard, such as the 2015 one, they kind of reset the clock. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense, but for the more stringent 2015 ozone standard, we are only classified as marginal. For the less strict 2008 standard, we are classified as severe, just because it's been a longer period of time that we haven't been able to attain. And we'll go to the next slide. And this gives you an idea of kind of, so for the US EPA ozone classifications, that's kind of the scale. So for 2015, we started as marginal, we're being bumped up to moderate, and we will be bumped up to serious probably in about 2 years, because we have not attained that standard. And we've already not attained that standard for this year, even though we're only about a month into the ozone season. For the 2008, as I mentioned, we are in serious non-attainment, and we will probably be bumped up, depending on this year's ozone season, to severe non-attainment in the future. So what does this stuff mean for you? That's what it really comes down to. What does it mean for the region? How does that actually impact everyday lives? So if you own a car in the region, you have to go to the Illinois EPA testing center, and they test your emissions with the tailpipe. They stick the little wand in there, and they check your diagnostic systems, all that. That is directly related to the fact that we are not in attainment for ozone. So the reason that we have to do that in this region is that is part of the Illinois EPA's response to our non-attainment area. It's called an inspection and maintenance program. And there's a whole bunch of other things that we do in this region that Illinois EPA is responsible for. And every time we get bumped up into a category, there's more things that we have to do. So that could be, as you know, another more tangible thing is we always switch over to a summer gasoline. That's one of the other things that is related to our non-attainment area for ozone. So we have the summer blend, that creates less emissions, and we potentially could have additional blends that they do, or we do more ethanol or other stuff. There's a variety of things. There's permitting that goes on. There's a whole bunch of stuff. So there's a series of options and a menu of options that every time you get bumped up, you have to do more things as a region to make sure that you're addressing ozone issues. Next slide. All right, so this is what it looks like. All these numbers that you see, this is a list of all the monitors for ozone in our region. All the numbers that you see here are above 70. 70 is the current standard for 2015. So anytime any one monitor has four exceedances, the entire region is considered to be in violation of the standard. And I think if you click it, we'll see some red circles. So let's see, hopefully, okay. Everything in red circles is a violation of the old standard. And this is just last year's ozone readings. So you can see we're not doing the current standard. We're not doing the previous standard. We have a long way to go on meeting our ozone responsibilities, where we're nowhere close. And as I said, anytime you see, in this case, you can just look at the top line also. There are 4 circles for exceedances above 75. That means that for that year, we did not even achieve the 2008 standard. And you can see there was a whole bunch of monitors that are in the same boat. So we have a really long way to go when it comes to ozone. We're nowhere close to where we need to be. And there's a lot that we need to be doing. So I think what I want to emphasize with this slide is that it's not like we're almost there. We're nowhere close to being there. So we're not close on the old standard, and we're not even nearly close on the new standard. And like I said, you basically, for lack of a better analogy, you get 3 swings at the piñata for free. And then the 4th one, that's when you're considered in violation. So any one monitor could have 3 exceedances. But if it gets a 4th one, then the entire region is in violation. What we have, what we call is the controlling monitor. That's the one that's the most in violation or has had the highest reading levels. Currently, that's our Northbrook monitor. Traditionally, it's been the Zion or there's another monitor that's not on here. That's actually part of our region. That's just over the border in Wisconsin, called the Chiwaukee monitor. So Zion and Chiwaukee traditionally have been where we've had the highest readings. Now it's been Northbrook. A lot of that has to do with the wind. Ozone gets transported and then deposited. And where it gets deposited is where we have the highest readings. You can go to the next slide. All right, so what do we have to do? What can we do at CMAP? You know, we're not an enforcement agency. We're not a regulatory agency, but there are things that we as an MPO are required to do and things that we can encourage folks to do. So what are we required to do? Under the Clean Air Act, we're required to do transportation conformity, and that's what I do. So I'm the staff person that's responsible for transportation conformity. The components of that really are, we have the TIP, which some of you may or may not be familiar with, but the TIP is the list of all the projects that are going on, infrastructure projects related to transportation in our region. A segment of those projects are what we call non-exempt. That's the work type. Those are the projects that are subject to air quality analysis. So those are those are your larger projects. Those are your adding capacity projects. Typically adding capacity means increases in VMT. So that's why there's grade separations, there's traffic signal interconnects. So there's kind of a menu of stuff that could potentially make stuff worse and stuff that could potentially make stuff better on the air quality front. So all of those projects are the ones that get modeled when I do transportation conformity, and I run this complicated MOVES model. In addition to all the transportation projects, all the latest planning assumptions are also part of that modeling process. So on to 2050, all the things that we call for, whether it's increased transit use, whether it's where the population, where we think the jobs and housing and all that stuff, where the growth is going to occur. You know, I believe in onto 2050, infill is a big component to our plan. So we model where that's going to happen versus if we had a different kind of plan that assumed a lot of growth in the far out region, parts of our region, that would have a different influence on the model. So the stuff that is baked into onto 2050 is part of my modeling process. So I take the transportation projects of air quality concern, I take the latest planning assumptions from onto 2050, and then we take all the latest forecast stuff from the travel demand model. And all that goes into the model that I have in outcomes emissions. And I'm not gonna lie to you, this is pretty complicated stuff. So when we get, you know, everybody wants that one number. What's the number? How can we achieve? And Martin showed some of that with greenhouse gas. A lot of that comes from this MOVES model. And just for sake of brevity, MOVES means Mobile Vehicle Emissions Simulator. So for me to do one model run takes about 6 hours. And we do a lot of these things. So I constantly are doing these things. We're refining the model. We're putting a lot of information into these things and a lot of assumptions that go into stuff when we look to the future. So next slide. All right, you can go to the next slide too. Particulate matter. So PM10, PM2.5, at one time we were kind of not in attainment. It's a bit of a technical stuff. There were some issues with the labs, and so we couldn't get a clean data reading. So we were technically called unclassifiable, which made us not in attainment because they couldn't say we attained because we had our samples at the lab were not of the level that they should be. They were not accepted. But we are currently in attainment. Now, I want to be clear about that. So PM10, we've never really had an issue with. PM 2.5, a lot of that stuff for PM, by the way, is what comes from your diesel trucks and locomotives and all that kind of stuff. It's really small particulate matter that gets embedded into people's lungs and stuff like that. So it's not good stuff. But at a regional level, which is what we look at for these standards and how CMAP is charged with looking at that, we are in attainment and have been in attainment of the standard for quite some time. So we've made progress on some of this stuff. Ozone, not so much, but PM, definitely. We are getting better at PM, you know, and you can see that in a tangible way. You see the CTA buses that are running on natural gas. You see, I know I've seen like Osinga cement trucks that are running on some sort of alternative fuel. I can't remember what they use now. I've seen bread trucks and stuff like that. So you're seeing more and more emphasis by private industry, by government. We buy new train locomotives all the time. We fund stuff with CMAQ. We even have a partnership with some of the private locomotives, you know, your freight carriers. So in some of the freight yards, they have switcher engines, and those engines don't leave the region. So we have partnered with them, and we've put tens of millions of dollars into changing those things to the most current standards. So why is that important? Because a switcher engine can operate 24 hours a day for 50 years. Some of the engines that we've replaced in the last 10 years were from the 50s. I mean, these things, that's just how they're designed. They're designed to just keep chugging away forever. And the freight companies don't have any incentive to replace them. They're still working. So why do they care? So through CMAQ, we were able to partner with them and help do that in a whole variety of yards throughout the region. And we continue to do that. We can go to the next slide. All right, and the next slide again. All right, so greenhouse gases, we already know that you've heard some of the presentations about what we do for greenhouse gas. As it's been mentioned already, CMAP models greenhouse gases as part of transportation conformity. So when I run the MOOS model, I get outputs for ozone, NOx, and VOC. I get outputs for PM 2.5, and I get outputs for greenhouse gas. The only one we have a budget to that we have to adhere to is ozone. And so when we run the model, we put all the stuff into it, and we run the model, and we have to show that we are under our motor vehicles emission budget that we have negotiated with US EPA and Illinois EPA. And that's how we demonstrate that we are conforming. So we literally, when it says transportation conformity, that means we're conforming to our motor vehicle emissions budget through the mix of projects and land use assumptions and traffic stuff that comes out of our travel demand model. And we do that twice a year typically. So now we've added to the mix greenhouse gas, so we can show it as an informational item. We don't have a budget. Martin mentioned that. We do want to set maybe targets. We're not required to do that. But what we want to do is establish some kind of baseline information. So we could say a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, this is where we're at, and this is the direction that we're heading. As was mentioned also, when we run the MOOS model itself is a regulatory thing. We have to use it. It's used across the country. In the model itself, if there has been a law that has been passed that mandates that cars get a certain gasoline standard, that the model takes that into consideration. And so when we're looking out to 2050, you assume that the fleet turns over and goes to a new kind of car, one that has better gas mileage, new kinds of pickups, new kinds of SUVs, trucks, what have you. So when there's a regulatory requirement that they go to a certain engine, that they get certain emission standards, when that comes online, the modeling process that we use takes that into consideration and it accounts for that. So we don't have to guess when these adaptations are going to occur. That's all part of the model, and everybody nationwide has to use the same model to do that. And then finally, what I want to say is, for greenhouse gas, we don't have the same thing that we have for ozone or PM. So for ozone and PM 2.5, there are monitors throughout the region. I believe there's, I can't remember how many PM monitors there are, but I think there's 14 for ozone throughout the region. There's no such thing as a GHG or a greenhouse gas monitor within the region. So we can't calibrate that against real world data. So everything that we do for greenhouse gas emissions modeling is just that, modeling. It's all theoretical. We don't have a way to real world check it. So that's one of the important differences between ozone, which we have monitors, PM, which we have monitors, and GHG, which we don't. So I hope that at least you take that away from this, that there are differences in how we can validate what we're doing. And partly that's why we don't probably have standards for GHG that have been mandated by the federal level, because it's hard to do that. You don't really have good baseline data. We can go to the next slide. I think this is the last one. So if you're really interested in ozone and how we're doing, there actually is a website. It's the AirNow website. This is run by the US EPA, and you can type in your zip code or a city or whatever it is, and you can get basically real world conditions within an hour. So what is it? It's 3:30 now. So probably the 2 o'clock reading for the ozone monitors are up there now. Probably about 3:45, you'd get the 3 o'clock readings. This was from, I want to say Thursday, maybe. So on Thursday, we've actually had Thursday and Friday were actually not good ozone days. Thursday was worse than Friday. And that's what it looked like. So anything in orange within our region is above the standard. So that would be above that 0.70, the 2015 standard. So it's 70 parts per billion. And then the yellow, we're not at the standard. We're just below violating the standard, but anything in orange, we definitely are. And you can see, if you had to guess which way the wind was blowing that day, I think you can just look at the map and see which way the wind was blowing. So some of what we do in Chicago in terms of generating ozone really has a negative impact on our brethren in Michigan. Some of those towns on the other side of the lake there have significant ozone issues in terms of not meeting the standards, and there's very little they can do about it because they generate almost none of the ozone that they have. So we are not necessarily the best neighbors for the region. And you could see just over the border there in Kenosha, that's also, a lot of that is generated by areas to the south of that. So the wind plays a big part. Our ozone, and there's a whole thing about ozone transport, we actually contribute to negative ozone or ozone problems, I should say, everywhere east and to the north of us. And there are other states who have complained about Illinois. I mean, we're talking about West Virginia, Pennsylvania. A lot of them say that the reasons that they can't improve is because the ozone gets transported from areas such as ours to their area. And what do you expect them to do? They can only change the gas so much, change and inspect cars so much, but if they're not actually the ones generating it, they don't have any control over the ozone. Conversely, what you don't see on this map is there are areas, let's say St. Louis and other areas that are generating ozone that's landing by us, but we are much more contributors to ozone problems in other regions than we are receivers of ozone issues. Next slide. And I think that's all I have today. So I can take questions there, or if you want to move on to the next presentation, I can wait to the end.
Since we're at 3:35 already, Russell, Jason, or Martin, if you all have a hard stop, please let us know. But I think we may have, we are over, but if members want to stick around for a couple of minutes to ask questions, if you all are available, perhaps we can entertain those questions now.
Yeah, I can actually answer. Let's see, I might unmute. In terms of the ozone monitoring on the southeast side, yes, there are monitors in Indiana. I will say, again, ozone is something that does transport. It's not one of these things that's localized. So in terms of having a monitor in the southeast side, that really wouldn't be capturing all that much versus the areas that are on the north end of our region, where a lot of the ozone that's generated gets deposited and becomes much more of an issue. So our southeast side monitors are not always our highest rating monitors. Like Will County, there's a ton of freight. That monitor is one of the ones that almost never goes off because most of the stuff generated there lands somewhere else. So that's one of the challenges with ozone, is it really is a regional problem because it can be generated in one area and deposited in another area. And so the solution might be having to trace it back to where it got generated, but also figure out how it got deposited. It's tricky stuff. And I think that was the only question for me.
Are there any other questions for either Russell, Martin, or Jason?
It looks like Renee has her hand raised.
Oh,
If that's cool. Sorry if somebody else has, if I've already asked a couple, so well, I'll go for it. Yeah, thank you for those presentations. It was really interesting. I'm always interested in when Jason comes on and talks about climate stuff, so thank you. Something that stuck out for me as a comment was about the effectiveness of the scenarios, and with that, the chart with all the percentages on it. And something I'm just thinking about a lot in the organizing spaces I'm in, and like in politics right now, is about all of the talk about electric vehicles. And I think like as a climate activist, like as people who are trying to make a difference, we're like losing the focus on that. We need to be on transit and we need to be walking and biking more. Like, yes, EVs are part of it, but there's so much work going into that, and we're like losing focus on the active transportation part. So that chart was like really helpful to see. It's like, oh, those are actually the effective things that are going to mostly reduce greenhouse gas, along with working from home, which somebody said maybe we don't always want to work from home. I'm cool with it for the time being. So thank you for that.
And if I could jump in real quick, I know I did a lot of the work that was on the slides that Martin put together. I just want to say that freight is such a huge component, that all those things, those good things that you mentioned about transit and walking, biking, are not going to influence freight. So I think that I know at CMAP we've discussed these all and above, but also maybe sector specific things that we have to do. So there might be stuff that's really good for commuter trips, really good for passenger trips, but then there might have to be some stuff that's very targeted at freight, which would be different. And I think we need to be mindful of the fact that different solutions will require different actions.
Yeah, that's why I actually asked the question about if there's monitors on the southeast side, because then I'm thinking about Little Village and the transportation hub that's trying to go in there, and the diesel exhaust, and the community there that's trying to advocate for a different industry coming in there so they don't have more air problems there. And then my other idea is somebody else like had just like a random thought, how we do like overflow action days for water overflow. Is there like something like that for air pollution? So I don't know, people could be like, oh, maybe I shouldn't drive to work today because it's already really bad. Or maybe a company could be like, oh, maybe I hold off bringing my 20 diesel trucks to downtown Chicago because it's already really bad.
There are ozone action days. Typically, they're only announced, because so much of it depends on the weather, by the Illinois EPA the day before. So I don't know how easy it is for folks to just kind of change gears. It is something we've discussed internally at CMAP. Maybe there might be something in the future that we're able to put together. It could be as simple as, don't mow your lawn today because lawn mowers contribute, but it needs to be regionalized versus kind of geographically specific. So it needs to be something that all of us can kind of try to contribute to. And I think that that's still a work in progress.
Yeah, I know that as a community organization, that is something I would use if something like that was accessible. Thank you.
all right. Thank you, Russell. Thank you, Martin. We really appreciate your time and for staying behind to answer questions. Oh, Faye, did you have another comment? Sorry, I'm just seeing your message in the chat.
Comment agreeing that it's fine to think we can individually contribute something to the effect, but it does not absolve corporations and businesses and government from the need to take systemic action. And we need the regulation. We don't need to tell them how they're going to reduce it. We just need to tell them they've got to reduce it. I get frustrated because yes, we can do individual action, but that is a red herring compared taking our eye off the ball and the importance of regulatory systematic change. That's all the comment I wanted to make.
Great point. Absolutely. And appreciate you mentioning that, something we all need to be cognizant of. But we do want to mention that Although we didn't have time to discuss the Prairie Path key recommendations, I did send this over to you all last week via email. The project managers, Tony Mano and Katie Piotrowska, wanted to actually get your feedback on that draft, but because we're over time, they had to drop off. But if any of you all had comments regarding those recommendations, I'm going to drop their email addresses in the chat. So feel free to reach out to them directly. They also mentioned they'd be willing to set up another meeting to talk about your feedback. But I do want to mention that they are open to receiving your feedback via email or even scheduling another meeting. So that's in the chat.
Do you know like what they were using that for?
Based on the communication they had with Dustin and I, so they basically have this draft of key recommendations on a corridor plan they're working on in, forgetting the city.
Actually, Michelle, I'm still here.
We still have Tony on, I think.
Yeah.
Tony's still here. Oh, sorry, Tony.
No, it's
thought you
okay.
jumped off.
Nope, I didn't want to interrupt. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you.
Great.
It's a corridor plan in Berkeley and Hillside that focuses on the Prairie Path, the Illinois Prairie Path, which is a bike trail, east-west bike trail that goes all the way out to St. Charles, I think. And then there's a small little downtown there that the two towns share. And so they're looking at ways to capitalize on the bike trail, on the bike path to attract some more economic development to the area. Are there access improvements? Are there facade improvements? Things like that. What the feedback we actually wanted from this committee is on how we wrote the recommendations. You're welcome to give us feedback on what your opinion is of the area if you're familiar. But really, we want to make sure that we are writing an accessible memo and laying out these recommendations in a way that the layperson can understand, that the non-planner, if you will, because CMAP, some of us are guilty, I will raise my hand, of using jargon, planning jargon a lot. And we wanted to make sure that this is a very accessible document, that what we're laying out here is understandable by anybody, whether or not they have a planning background, and being inclusive too, frankly, making sure that the recommendations, of course, we are looking at are for everybody, but we want to make sure we're laying them out in a way that the person who can or can't walk understands that we are taking them into consideration. That's one example. So you're welcome to give us feedback on the actual project and what we are actually recommending for the area, but we also want to know that how it reads, if that is accessible and it makes sense to those that might not understand some of the planning theories and terms that we're talking
Okay.
about. So thank you.
Yeah, I thought some of the comments were great. I was curious as a question as to what stormwater considerations, where are there problems now, if any, along the Prairie Path, and how could the Prairie Path impact positively the retention, detention, absorption of any stormwater problem areas?
That's a great question. Hi, Faye. Nice to see you. We actually found through our existing conditions analysis that there was not a lot of flooding issues in the area, even anecdotally as well. So we're suggesting that they add more native plants and trees along Taft Avenue, which is the main north-south thoroughfare, and then also along the Prairie Path too, to help with that if that is an issue, but also just aesthetically as well. But we did not find that there were a lot of issues there, and
Good.
they have retention about, yeah, so we did investigate that, but it's still a consideration. And then also to address Renee's question or comment, yes, this is a memo to the villages, and then our next step here is to develop some illustrations and renderings to show these improvements, site plan as well, for public engagement out on the path and on our website, the engagement website as well. So we will stylize these, and so it is not just a text memo. But we had to start with the bland memo. Thank you for changing that from a thumbs up to a heart. Started with the bland memo, but it will go to a pretty, some pretty pictures. That's the plan at least. So thank you.
Okay, I totally agree with more trees, because it's could get pretty hot biking along.
Yes,
And I think it's an opportunity for education in terms of native plants and how pretty native borders can be. At the same time, as it with all greenways, that takes maintenance. So that has to be built in to the planning and the understanding of the municipalities. Otherwise, they'll just mow it.
Right.
So that's a toughie. Certainly there's more and more studies on low maintenance natives that have, a lower profile and yet still are attractive and still can be useful from an educational perspective.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great point. And I would love any suggestions if you wanted to email them to me. But we are working closely with both villages and they are eager to implement what we recommend. And I think they will have the capacity to do the maintenance. And we'll make sure when we put out the implementation steps that they understand that there will be some long-term maintenance associated with this. But they've been with us every step of the way. And they're just reviewing it right now. So we haven't unveiled it to the public yet. And then we'll do a presentation for that too. And then so there'll be another round of some approvals and things too.
Yeah, the only other question was are there universal accessibility issues? I noticed that some of the comments said it would be nice to separate walking from the biking. I don't know how feasible that is. And more bike racks, certainly around the restroom, but also to encourage businesses who want to be accessible to people who might be going along the bike path to stop and then have refreshments to consider using bike racks by their place of business to demonstrate that they invite the users of the bike path to come in and sit a while.
Yep, precisely. That is exactly what we are suggesting. And
Yeah.
again, there are no issues with that we have heard, but again, we've spoken to the public virtually and through our engagement website, but we'll be unveiling this throughout the summer and hopefully doing some more surveying out there to make sure that we are capturing any of those issues. But yes, some people did ask about widening the path, and both the Public Works and Berkeley and Hillside both kind of freaked out at that.
Yeah,
that
can
seems like a
understand
bigger,
why.
yeah. But so far we have not heard that there are any issues, but part of our recommendations will be to ensure that every access point is accessible to all.
And I understand that at either end, it's compatible with what villages at the east and west ends are doing, so that there's a kind of common understanding.
There hopefully will be. I think Berkeley and Hillside are taking the next step forward to make some improvements, and we hope that Elmhurst will pay attention to Maywood as well. But we're also looking at it through that lens too, to ensure that whatever we suggest and how they make improvements could be carried forward. And we're also talking to those towns as well, just to let them know what we're up to. And what could be coming in the future.
Yeah, I think you did a good job of speaking in kind of everyday English.
Well, thank you for that. That's the kind of feedback we were looking for. I really appreciate that.
Well, thanks, Tony, for sticking around. Any public comments? Just moving on to the next item. Hearing none. Again, I do want to mention, I provided Tony and Katie's email address in the chat. Dustin and I will also follow up with everyone via email. So if you have other comments to share, feel free to email them. So I'm now going to entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved. This is Faye.
Faye, thank you. Can I have that seconded? Can I have a second?
Second.
Was that
Elliot?
Thank you, Elliot. All right, meeting is adjourned. We will see you all in September. Thank you all for sticking around for the last 20 minutes. So we appreciate your time and look forward to seeing you all in September.
Thank you for really, really good presentations.
That was a tremendous meeting, very informative. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Right. So I think we're